Now, when you learn to drive, you're 17 years old, you tend to get yourself a bit of a crappy old car, and you learn to drive on a crappy old car. The reason why you might learn to drive on a crappy old car, besides the fact it's probably all that you can afford, is that when you're getting experience, sometimes you crash. Now, learning to run a reef aquarium is almost a little bit like that. So, when you're an inexperienced reefer, sometimes you do not have the experience to thrive or allow your animals to thrive. So, just like learning to drive with a cheap car is not a bad idea, then learning to drive or learning to run a reef aquarium on a smaller scale before you go to the bigger scale is not a bad idea. So in saying that, let's say that you set up a beautiful little nano tank and you learn all the concepts of reef keeping. I would recommend jumping on our YouTube channel and learning the 8-point principles, and I would definitely learn the material on the Red Sea DVD, which is on our channel, and the Marine Aquarium DVD, and the Reef Aquarium. So if you just go on YouTube and put in Paul Talbot and you write Aquarium Guide, Reef Guide, there's all these videos you can watch that teach you all this stuff, and also watch the 8-point principles seminar. The 8-point principles seminar breaks everything you need to know into 8 points. Now, in saying that, once you've got the information, then starting a relatively manageable aquarium is a really good idea. Now, a smaller aquarium is not actually easier. A big aquarium is actually more stable, and relative to the amount of stock you put in there, a big tank can be potentially even easier than a small aquarium. But the thing is, you just don't have the risk with a small aquarium. So let's say you started off with something like this nano aquarium. Now, this is a perfect way of understanding the principles of reef keeping. Now, down the track, once you're confident and you start to grow your corals and you start to see your fish thriving and you start to understand the principles of running an aquarium, then you may then be brave enough to go and invest in a bigger, more fancy, and ultimately more expensive aquarium, which obviously has a lot more to risk, because something like this, you're going to invest a lot of money in it. So if you did start with a nano aquarium, it's like starting with a cheaper car. It allows you to crash if you've got to, without the devastation of learning to drive in a Ferrari and crashing a Ferrari. So you can get your experience in an old Corona or something like that. Then as you get more experience at driving, then you might be more confident to buy a more expensive car. Now, that can very much be a similar correlation with our reef aquarium. You can learn to drive or learn to keep your aquarium on a smaller scale. Then when you are confident, you then go and invest in the big one. And then your nano becomes an invaluable and perfect quarantine tank. Because once you've spent a lot of money getting a very big, very fancy reef aquarium in which you now know all the principles and you're now confident to look after it, then you're able to use the smaller one as a quarantine. And you can use it for quarantining any new corals, and that will reduce the risk of pests getting into your big tank. So therefore, any money that you spent setting up the nano will end up being very good value if that means that you're reducing the amount of pests that you're putting into the big tank. It also allows you to pre-quarantine any fish that you're going to put in there, because the fish that you put into your main tank may bring disease into your main tank. Whereas if you pre-quarantine your fish for a month, that allows you to identify if the fish have got any sorts of diseases due to the low immune system that the fish may have potentially experienced during the ride to your, or what's involved with the fish getting to you. And it also allows the fish to build their immune system back up. So your fish are nice and healthy and strong before going into the main tank. So you are able to identify any issues with the fish before you go putting a new fish into the main tank, and you may risk the fish that go into the main tank. Because if you have a lot of money's worth of fish in the main tank, it's absolutely silly not to enjoy the security of pre-quarantining your fish. Because that way, if you have a wipeout because you bring disease into your aquarium, then the quarantine tank has paid itself off as far as offering insurance for your fish and offering insurance for pests and so forth with your corals. Now, the other thing to be overly conscious of as well is, as a beginner, you really want to start with very easy to keep corals. You want to start with any of your morphs, things like your zoas. You want to, things like leathers. Now, there are various soft corals and so forth that are actually very easy to look after. And here at Majestic Aquariums, we call them number one corals. So a number one coral is very easy to keep. Now, once you have graduated with number one coral, bubbles, and number one easy corals, you then can start to move to number two corals. So that's, in general, a lot of your LPS corals. They're a little bit harder to keep than your morphs or zoas or soft corals. When you get confidence with them, you may then move to your SPS. So typically the SPS corals tend to be harder to look after. They require more stability. So if you want to be precautious, and if you're not in a rush, then you would start out with a quarantine tank with easy to keep coral. Then when your confidence is up, you can then go and get your big tank. Then you can slowly upgrade the coral that you've got according to the equipment that you have on the tank at the time and according to your confidence and experience. Now, that's the same with the fish. So with the fish, we also label all of our fish. So a number one fish tends to be very easy to keep. A number two fish requires a little bit more experience, and a number three fish requires a lot of experience. You do not want to buy a number three fish unless you are very confident with your fish keeping, because you would need to be getting everything right, and you would need to know that when you are buying a number three fish or a number three coral, you are buying a risk. If you buy a number one coral or a number one fish, then if you get everything right, the coral really should be okay. If you buy a number two, then it should be okay, but even if you get everything right, maybe it won't be. So what the 1, 2, 3 idea does is give you a little bit of power with what you purchase, because there's nothing worse than you starting out in this hobby, getting yourself a nice, big, beautiful aquarium. You do not have the experience to keep the fish and coral that you choose, so therefore the whole thing ends up being a disaster. When you could have started with animals that are much easier to keep, to build your confidence and experience, and you could start with a nano aquarium, so therefore you have way less financial risk. And then once you're confident with the animals you're keeping and you're confident with your aquarium principles, then you can move on to getting your nice big dream tank, and you've got a little bit of experience under your belt, because there's nothing worse than starting out in this hobby and crashing a Ferrari, so to speak.